Attention! This makes absolutely no sense. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Zander's Facts.
Hello everybody, welcome into the latest edition of the Zander's Facts podcast. I am of course the aforementioned Zander. It is Wednesday, February 14th, 2024. Happy Valentine's Day everybody. I think that you are going to love this podcast, which is why we're having it on Valentine's Day, even though I think y'all love every podcast we do here on Zander's Facts. This one though is a good one. This week on episode 133, we are talking basketball. Because as you all know, the Super Bowl football season, that happened on Sunday. Football season is over now. And so that usually means that a lot of fair weather fans tend to move over towards basketball. Now, if you're a fair weather fan, I'm not calling you out. I'm just saying that's what's happening. So if you are not as well versed in professional basketball at this stage in mid-February, no fear, because we have our very own Zander's Facts senior NBA analyst Hillbilly, who is back on the podcast this week to update you all on the NBA. As we come up this weekend is the All-Star Game, so it's a great time to have a little NBA season update. That's what we got coming for you this week on the podcast. Before we get to that, just wanted to remind you all that if you like the Zander's Facts podcast, if you think you're going to like all the facts on this week's edition, remember to follow this podcast, download this episode 133, rate and review the podcast, check us out on all the socials, Threads, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, at Zander's Facts, that is Zander with a Z, and most importantly, remember to tell all of your friends, spread the facts, y'all, tell all your friends about the podcast, the newsletter, Zander's Weekend Facts. If you didn't know, that's a recap of the week's top headlines. It comes out every Sunday morning. If you're not signed up, sign up in this episode's description. The link is there. Check it out. It is free to sign up. Also, check out the Zander's Facts link tree. It's also linked to this episode's description because that has all the Zander's Facts links that you need, including where to find all past 132 episodes of the podcast, usually probably wherever you're listening to this podcast. But make sure if you've missed any of our past episodes and you're interested in them to go back and listen to any of our past 132 podcast episodes wherever you get your podcasts, including last week's Super Bowl preview. I know it's already happened, but you just might want to go take a look at my prediction that I made last week. Spoiler alert! It was a pretty fact-filled prediction. So, we're not talking about football anymore. We are talking about basketball, and I want to get straight to our Zander's Facts senior NBA analyst, Hillbilly. He is back on the podcast this week, providing an update on the NBA season with just about 2 months to go before the playoffs begin. So it's a big time to get to basketball, y'all. Let's get to it as we are talking NBA season update with our Zander's Facts NBA analyst, Hillbilly, right here as the Zander's Facts podcast continues.
Zander's Facts.
Welcome back, everybody, to episode 133 of the Zander's Facts podcast. As I told y'all previously, football season is over, which means now everybody is talking about basketball. And the one man who has been watching basketball this whole time is joining us on the podcast this week. Our very own Zander's Facts senior NBA analyst, Hillbilly, is returning for another edition on the podcast. Hillbilly, how are you?
I'm super happy to be here.
Super happy. Oh my gosh.
Super,
so as y'all know,
super duper happy.
The Super Bowl was on Sunday. Hillbilly doesn't know that because he didn't watch the Super Bowl.
I watched a little bit of it.
A little. Did you watch the end overtime?
We watched like the first quarter.
No.
No, I didn't say any of that.
It was actually a really good game. Like it went down to the
That's
like
what I
the end
hear.
of overtime. It was the second longest game in NFL history.
Fact.
I hear there was some griping about the announcing too.
Ooh, I don't know, Jim.
Everything was covered. It really was. And he has to get around the hand. He wanted to throw. That looked a little Mahomey on that one, too. And
Anyway, we're going into basketball right now. It's a good time to talk about basketball because they do this thing where the NBA All-Star Game is a week after the Super Bowl now. So it gives us like a little break where it's a good time to finally catch up on basketball. And that's what Hillbilly's going to do for us this week on the podcast. We're going to talk about what Hillbilly thinks are the biggest Surprises in the NBA, good surprises, your teams are doing well. Bad surprises, your teams might not want to be on that list, not doing so well. The biggest storylines that are going on, the trade deadline just happened last week too. Records have been broken in the NBA this season. There's been a ton going on that we have to catch you all up on this NBA catch-up podcast with our Zander's Facts NBA analyst Hillbilly. We would not have anyone else talk about basketball with us than Hillbilly. So let's just get into it, Hillbilly. Your 5 good surprises. I think that's how we're going to structure this podcast this week. Hillbilly's 5 good surprises, his 5 bad surprises, and then of course we've got other things to talk about too. But the teams that have done better than expected, or maybe not better than Hillbilly expected, because Hillbilly knows what was going to happen at the beginning of the season, so he knew these teams were going to be good. We can start out in the Western Conference, though. One of our other Xander's Facts basketball people on this podcast, Andrew, would like this. The Oklahoma City Thunder are number 1 on your list, Hillbilly, for probably good reason. They are tied for second right now in the West. They're just a half game back. 36-17 is their record. They lead the league in field goal percentage, blocks per game, and deflections. They're second in net rating. They're third in three-point percentage, fourth in steals, and they're fifth in offensive and defensive rating. And Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is an all-star starter, and he leads the league in steals. But from what you've seen, Hillbilly, how have the Thunder maintained their consistency at the top of the West this season? Because it hasn't been like they just got there. They've been there this whole time.
Yeah, they've been either first or tied for first or second for at least a month or two now. And it's really remarkable to see it. I mean, we knew at the beginning of the season when we did the preseason show that the Thunder were really in an incredible position to do really well, really quickly with a really young team. What I don't think anybody really realized was just how good Chet Holmgren was going to get and how quickly. I think we figured he would probably be a good defensive player right off the bat. It turns out he's a great defensive player immediately. And then he's also just very, very talented offensively, which is, I think, the part that really caught, most people by surprise. He's still shooting, almost 40% from the 3-point line, shooting well over 50% for field goals. He's doing it really well. And they have kind of gotten away with being able to play him at center, which, he's a real mismatch for a lot of centers out there. So, you look at just how good this team is and how quickly they've gotten there. And it really is remarkable. I mean, Shai Gilgeous, you said at the introduction to him that, he's going to be in the All-Star game. I mean, he's pretty much a lock to be a first team All-NBA player at this point. Now that Embiid's out of the discussion, which we'll talk about later, he is probably in the top 3 for MVPs right now. He's just one of the best players in the league. And, we talked about him at the end of last year a little bit too, talking about how he's already a good enough player to be the best player on a championship winning team. And this year, he's doing what he did again last year, but even better, and just showing that's who he is. But, the remarkable thing is guys like Jalen Williams, who is in his second year, and Chet Holmgren already putting in like all-star caliber seasons, and how good they are now. But each one of them is kind of showing that they're at least going to develop into players that can be, at a minimum, I think, the second or third best player on a championship winning team. And, it's starting to look like maybe they're already there. The stats that you brought up in the beginning are dominant for any team. It's just the fact that they're doing it so young. It's kind of reminds you of the last time the Thunder were good. They've got this amazing young talent, and we'll see if they're better at keeping it together now. But one thing that they have that the Oklahoma City team didn't have with Kevin Durant, Westbrook, and Harden is a mountain of draft picks still. They already have the players. They're already demonstrating it this year that they have the players on the roster now to do it. But they have all of these draft picks coming up. And, they're able to use that to help, keep the roster together or, help keep the machine kind of going. They're able to do things like take slight little risks on someone like Gordon Hayward, which they just picked up at the trade deadline. He's a player that if everyone remembers, big time college player, was doing great in the NBA. Then he got injured playing for the Celtics in his very first game as a Celtic. And everyone's kind of forgotten about him because he doesn't play that. He only plays about half the time now. But while he's playing, he's still really productive. And the Thunder only had to use a second round draft pick to get him. It's really brilliant moves like that to bringing guys like that in, which is why they're competitive now.
Well, can I ask you a question? Has Chet played LeBron James yet in the NBA?
Yes.
Because you remember last year, the man is still a twig, but
and actually, the Lakers have given him trouble because they still are figuring out with the bigger teams with players like Anthony Davis and Minnesota's Rudy Gobert. He can have a little bit of trouble with guys that are like that big and strong. Someone like Embiid can just kind of put him in the rim. But he's better than at least I thought he would be about kind of compensating for that. And I think he's played basically every game. He might have missed one or two games so far this season. So been really resilient too.
That is pretty good. He just needs to get rid of the facial hair because it looks disgusting. He has had 4 blocks in a game this season, though. Only a man named Victor Wembanyama has more blocks this season. Yet Victor Wembanyama is not leading his team to the success that Chet Holmgren's
No, and he's
team.
not shooting with the same efficiency, and he's not doing some of the things that Holmgren does so well. Like when he gets the ball and he's got a little bit of space for a 3-pointer, but his guys closing out on him, he makes that decision like instantaneously. Do I have time for the shot, or do I need to, try to attack the closeout? And he makes the decision. He makes the correct decision really quickly, and it's stuff like that, especially at his age, he just really has a lot of advantages. And
Chet also is 4th in the NBA in blocks per game. He's averaging 2.6 per game this season, which is kind of crazy for, I guess, is he technically a rookie? Because he didn't play last season, but it's his second year.
He didn't play at all last season, so it's just like Embiid.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, well,
Embiid also missed his first year, and then he had his rookie year late. And it's funny because when they're the inevitable comparison is to Victor Wembanyama, who the Spurs are. There's absolutely zero reason to watch that team at all because it's awful this year, except for him because he is so remarkable. And of course, we're seeing now when we see just how good Chet is, that this looks like a budding rivalry, for a long time. And the rookie of the year race is really interesting. Towards the beginning of the year, I think it looked like Chet had it sewn up, but I think that Wembanyama's really kind of caught up. Wembanyama gets, he has higher usage. So he's going to have more of the counting stats, like he has more points and everything. But the comparison, he's not as efficient as Holmgren is. And he's not really playing within, or not at least demonstrating that he's playing within a system as well. But
yeah, the Spurs are last in the West. They have 10 wins on the season. That's a 1.189 winning percentage, which is only 3rd worst. They're only ahead of the Pistons, who had a record-tying 28-game losing streak this season.
Uh-oh.
And the Wizards, who are only a game ahead of the Pistons.
Yeah, and the really sad thing about the Pistons and the Wizards is that when I came up with a list of disappointments, I don't have them on there, despite them being that awful, because it's not a disappointment. It's exactly what I expected. So but the Spurs have been interesting to watch because they've been doing some really kooky stuff. Like they started the beginning of the season playing Jeremy Sohan, who is a forward, kind of like almost like a power forward at point guard, and he can't shoot at all. And so it's just kind of a weird experiment that he was running. And it's just, I thought that Popovich would have more of an urgency to win, given his age. But they really seem to be taking a very, very long-term approach in San Antonio. So
you would think he's 75 years old, but One of the big players you mentioned against Chet earlier this season was Rudy Gobert and the Minnesota Timberwolves, who are first right now in the West, 36-16. Actually, earlier this season on February 7th, which was it was a week ago from this podcast coming out, we had 4 teams that were tied atop of the West. We had the Clippers, the Thunder, the Timberwolves, and the Nuggets. They all had the same record. They were tied atop the Western Conference. On February 7th, which is the latest into a season that 4 or more teams were tied for first in a conference in NBA history. How about that? So the Thunder, they may be like third on the list, but they're right there, and so were the Nuggets and the Clippers. But the Timberwolves right now hillbilly hold the first spot because they have Rudy Gobert, who has helped the team lead the league in defensive rating, but they also are second in 3-point percentage.
This is true.
Thanks to players like Anthony Edwards.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch the Timberwolves. I mean, I felt the same way as a lot of people when they picked up Gobert and spent so much to get him. Giving up basically their entire draft future to Utah and a really good player in Walker Kessler to get Rudy. It's just a guy who can't play any offense. And then last year, it seemed like we were all right. It was just a really stupid move. And then this year, all of a sudden, it clicks into place. I think part of it is that Gobert is healthier than he was last year. And all of a sudden, they have this just dominating defense that is really just shutting teams down. And they've got 2 7-footers that they have figured out how to keep on the field or on the court the whole time. Anthony Edwards is coming along. He's really starting to, everyone's been kind of talking about him as a future star for a couple of years now. And this is the year where he's really starting to put it together. He's got his 3-point shot is right under 40% now, which is a significant improvement over what he had been doing. His free throw percentage, all of his percentages are going up. He's becoming a more efficient player as he gets older, and while he's also scoring more points. So he's just doing all the things that you expect to see an ascending star do, and is a ton of fun to watch. I still kind of worry about the Timberwolves a little bit as far as being a contender later, just because of who's running the offense. They rely on Mike Conley so much, and he does a good job for them. But Mike Conley, I mean, if you can remember him back, he was the point guard with Greg Oden at Ohio State.
Whoa.
He's been in the league for a really long time, and they really depend on him. And when he's out, their offense has just been awful. And in close end of game scenarios, they don't perform as well as they might. Kind of worry about their offensive ability going in to the playoffs, as defenses really get a chance to clamp down on it. But they are fun to watch, and the defense is just amazing.
And Mike Conley's 5th in the league in 3-point percentage. He's almost at 45%.
He's playing really well. The problem isn't the way he's playing. It's just how reliant on him they are, because Anthony Edwards isn't really going to be that kind of play facilitator like Conley is, and certainly not going to be Cat. And Gobert you really don't want him running the offense.
No, he's better inside. He's second in the league in rebounds per game at 12.5. But
I was just going to say, he is remarkable. He has pretty much got a stranglehold on Defensive Player of the Year, right? Already, like unless he really falls off, I think he's got it this year. He's not even an all-star, which just goes to show even the coaches didn't vote him on to the reserves, which I thought was surprising because he's obviously so valuable to this team. You look at the turnaround, but I guess it's just offense is, what's most important.
Yeah, the fact that he's only averaging 13 points a game, basically.
Yeah, but he's basically single-handed, well, not single-handedly, but been by far the biggest reason they have the best defense in the league, too, or consistently ranked towards that.
I think you mentioned it, but a common characteristic those first 2 teams have on your good surprises is, at least for me, that I wouldn't count on these teams to be contenders later in the season, especially when you look at the other teams we have in the West. One of them, who I think we're going to talk about in a little bit on the good surprises, but the Thunder and the Timberwolves, both of whom, you remember the Timberwolves, was it last year the Timberwolves won the play-in game and then they celebrated like the NBA Finals? It just goes to show that these teams they haven't been to the Western Conference Finals or the NBA playoffs or the finals before. And we saw the Grizzlies the last couple years who were finishing second in the West. They didn't have the experience and then they faltered in the playoffs.
They also had a lot of injuries, and their Ja Morant was in the middle of imploding. But
well, and now the Grizzlies. We're not going to talk about the Grizzlies because they're not worth mentioning right now.
Not this year. But I will say with the Timberwolves, and the Thunder, as far as being contenders go, it seems it's unlikely, but it also does happen every so often where a team just ascends very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And then like the Warriors did, where, 1 month you have Charles Barkley saying a jump shooting team could never win the finals. And then all of a sudden it's like they just rewrote the NBA and things are different, And of those two teams, I do see the Thunder as being a little bit more like that. I mean, if they're kind of zagging while the rest of the league is zigging with, size, and they figured something out where having a mobile big like Holmgren out there, they can just run all of these other centers down. Who knows what that's going to do in the playoffs? It's really unlikely that either one of those teams has the maturity and the experience to do it. Like those teams don't know how hard it is to play in the playoffs yet, and how deep you have to go, I guess. But they both do seem to really be ascending quick.
Yeah, well, I mean, who knows what could happen? We've got 2 months left in the regular season too. I mean, these teams could absolutely falter to end the regular season.
I wouldn't be surprised to see either one. I mean, the Thunder have trailed off recently. It kind of seems like they're having a harder time getting up for every game.
It'll be interesting to see what happens because, again, like you saw with the transition from the Heat and the Spurs, who were the two dominant teams when LeBron was with Miami, to immediately the next year Golden State sweeping the Cavs with LeBron and just changing the NBA, how that shift happened. There could be a shift this year. We'll find out. We'll talk about that later on when you're back on the podcast closer to the playoffs. Let's go to the East now for a little bit and talk about the number one team in the East who have the best record in the NBA, the Boston Celtics, who are 5 games ahead of the second place team, who's also on this good surprises list. So we'll talk about them in a little bit, but they also lead the league, the Celtics, who were 1 game away from the NBA Finals last year, represented the East in the Finals 2 years ago. They're first in rebounds, blocks per game, 3-pointers made, net rating, and 40% of their points come from 3-pointers, which is also number 1 in the league. But Hillbilly, they're the only one of 2 teams who are in the top 5 of the net rankings, the offensive rating, and defensive rating this season. The Thunder are also the other.
It's a fact.
The Celtics, because of their roster makeup, you trust the Celtics a lot more.
Yeah, well, kind of. I worry about the Celtics when it comes to injuries. And I do still have some lingering doubts about how they're going to perform in late games in the playoffs because they still show a lot of the same stupid stuff they do. But, those numbers do tell the story that you recited earlier. I mean, they have been from start to finish easily the most consistent team in the NBA this year. I mean, they're just winning regularly. They're putting away the bad teams. They're competing well against the good teams. They don't really have any holes in their 6-man lineup. It's just after that 6th man that you start to worry a little bit because that's when you start to get into the Luke Cornettes of the world who can be okay, but not necessarily. And one of those 6 players is Al Horford, who's, I think, 72 years old this year. I mean, he's been around forever. And the other is Kristaps Porzingis, who typically gets injured late in the year every year. And, we'll see. Hopefully that won't happen because Porzingis has just been absolutely fantastic for them. I mean, he's really been everything that we thought he was going to be back in his New York Knicks days. He's really kind of recuperated his career here. Putting up over 20 points a game on a team that has a lot of good scorers on it. So that Jason Tatum really can that helps him out a ton too. They just kind of have everything going on right now. But I was watching them play the Nuggets a few weeks ago, and it was a game in Boston. It came right down to the wire. The Celtics had the ball with just a couple seconds left to go, but enough to get a playoff. They get it to Tatum, and rather than drive strong to the rim, he does get in the paint, but he does this stupid little fall away where he's obviously just trying to draw a foul. And everybody knows he's going to do it, so nobody fouls him. And it just puts up this pathetic shot at the end that bounces off and they lose. And, it's just that kind of stuff that the Celtics have been doing for years that really make me kind of wonder if they are really as dominant as everybody thinks. But they have been very dominant for the regular season, surprisingly so. They're better than I thought they would be, given how shallow their depth is. And they're a lot of fun to watch because they play a really nice brand of basketball.
I'll tell you, because I watched on Sunday, Boston played Miami. Miami has kind of been middling along the season. They're 28-25. They're 8th in the East. They had a 7-game losing streak earlier this year, which for some teams might not be, so bad. But that's their worst since 2008, which goes to show you how good Miami's been for a while. But in the game against Boston, they were without Jimmy Butler. And it was a 4-point game. Boston won. But with who Miami had on the floor and who Boston had on the floor, you would have expected Boston to kind of roll a little more. They were favored by more points than they won. But in the fourth quarter, what could have been consequential, Miami was in it until the end. Jaylen Brown does something silly with Duncan Robinson, a little hook and a hold. And Robinson gets thrown to the ground. Jaylen Brown gets a flagrant foul, number 1. And I think it goes to show you how championship teams need good coaching. You can't have a bad coach coaching a championship team. I'm not saying Joe Mazzulla is a bad coach, but I'm just saying that that's what Boston needs, at least right now. Because things like that Jaylen Brown did, especially if the Heat and the Celtics meet up again in the playoffs, which is certainly possible, those things will cost you in the playoffs.
Yeah, and I think that I mean it's tough to tell with Mazzulla just how good a coach he is, but I don't know how strong a presence he really is there. And Boston's the kind of team where, when you have your best player is a guy like Tatum that isn't necessarily like your vocal leader in the team. I don't know that has that strong, gravity and presence about him that a lot of the really great players do, or at least it just kind of hasn't shown yet. I mean, he seems like a really good teammate and obviously a fantastic player, but just that kind of guy that's going to make sure that everybody is on and focused, when it's time and when it really matters. And so if the coach isn't either, that, maybe that's part of what's been going on with Boston over the years. But I mean, the other thing to remember is, we get spoiled with Boston. They're good every single year. So it feels like Tatum's been around forever. He's only 25 years old. I mean, hasn't even really entered his prime compared to, the typical arc of an NBA player. He's just coming into it. I think Jaylen Brown's only like a year older than him. So, they're still actually getting better, probably. And probably more mature and smarter. Hopefully we'll see that in the playoffs for them. But, I think the Heat game that they had is just kind of that's what to expect. Like if those two teams meet up in the playoffs,
good stuff.
Yeah, I remember, when like the year that the Bucks won the championship, they did demolish the Heat in the playoffs that year. But typically that's not what happens. Typically the Heat are very competitive until you really just finally beat them to death. Like last year in the championship game, they were just beat by that point. But I mean, they really had, they went out fighting as much as they could. And, you expect that. Like if they're in a playoff series with Boston this year, it's going to be a knockdown, drag out fight that I think Boston would probably win, but I think Miami would have a good shot at it.
Listen, that would be the third year in a row they met in the playoffs because they've met in the Eastern Conference finals the last 2 years in a row. But back to your good surprises list, Billy. Number 4 on this list, we have to go back to the Western Conference for, is the Los Angeles Clippers, who are tied with the Thunder for second. They're only a half game back of the Timberwolves. Russell Westbrook is on that team. Russell Westbrook isn't even, one of the best players they have on the team, but he is still, here's a fact for you, the second player in NBA history to have 25,000 career points, 9,000 career assists, and 8,000 career rebounds, LeBron James. So it's nice to have him on your team with James Harden, Kawhi Leonard, who was third in three-point percentage and fourth in steals in the league, and Paul George, who is fifth in three-pointers made this season for a team that is first in the league, Hillbilly, in three-point percentage, and is right at the top of the West, which you would expect if you have Kawhi Leonard and Paul George on your team.
Yeah, well, if you have a healthy Kawhi Leonard and Paul George on your team, which we
true.
just never have. If you remember last year, I picked the Clippers beginning to go all the way because I thought like eventually they have to have a healthy year. And that when they do, they're so good that, I don't know that anyone is better than them in the West. I mean, maybe the Nuggets, but I don't know. The way Kawhi is playing this year is just, it's absolutely incredible to watch him. He is every bit as good as any player in the league right now. He's not in the MVP running, and shockingly, they gave first team or a starting all-star nod to LeBron over Kawhi, which is a tragedy.
LeBron was the
Kawhi's having a
captain.
much better.
He wasn't just
I
a
know.
starter. He was the captain.
It's so stupid. Kawhi is so much more valuable for his team this year. It's not even close. And so, it stinks to watch that. But, everyone that's watching, like you said, he's not just really high in 3-point percentage this year, where he's shooting 45.5% on a pretty high volume, scoring, over 24 points a game. His field goal percentage for someone that's typically in the perimeter is at 52.8%, which is fantastic. He's rebounding, but I forget what you said, if he was like third or fourth in steals. He's back to being that defensive player that can just shut someone down. The Thunder, who, obviously I can't, gush enough about, when they went to LA to play him a couple weeks ago, Kawhi was on Shea at the end of the game, and he just shut Shea Gilgeous-Alexander down, which nobody has been able to do that all year. He's good for 30 points every game. He's just, it's remarkable how much it's come together with the James Harden trade, with Russell Westbrook accepting his position, on the bench. They're just full of talent, ton of fun to watch. They're well coached. You can't help but root for them. I mean, the poor Clippers with one of the worst histories in the NBA. So it's a good season, and it's just fun to watch them.
And they're getting a new arena pretty soon, right next to the what is it called? The SoFi Stadium football. It's right. First off, I don't understand. They have the Forum right there, but they're building a new arena. Why not just build that there? I don't know. But they are getting a new arena, which apparently is going to be very fancy. Steve Ballmer, richest, if not one of the richest owners in the NBA, is going to make it all fancy.
No, he's the richest owner in the NBA. I think he's the richest owner of any team, major league team in America.
That was a fact.
But they'll have that pretty soon. So this is, and if those two players can obviously start to build perhaps a championship winning team, it could happen this year, it could happen next year, but that's a good way to open a new arena and separate yourself, because when they play in Staples Center, they have to cover up all the Laker banners.
Yeah, it's really sad. Whoever's job that is, that sucks. Yeah, no, and they've got a team to root for. I mean, they play really tough. It's really easy to root for them, at least in my experience. I've watched a lot of Clippers this year, and I'm normally not a fan of James Harden at all. He's playing so good right now. He should be an all-star himself. I mean, he's right at that level.
And I think it helps to the fact that in Philly, he was one of two guys. It was him and Embiid, and now he's third behind Kawhi and Paul George.
Yeah, and they've got other really good players on that team too. Like Amir Coffey is a great guy coming off their bench that every time they put him in there, he looks really good. Terrence Mann, they still have. They've been unwilling to trade him off, which was been a good move because he's a really good player. Zubats plays well for him in the middle. They've just other guys like Norman Powell coming off the bench, who's just a very accomplished scorer. They're just a very well put together team.
Next season is when the Intuit Dome is going to open for the Clippers. How about that? So, number 5 now on Hillbillies. Good surprises. You want to be on this list because you're doing pretty well. The team that, as of Monday night, when we're recording this podcast, Monday, February 12th, holds the longest active winning streak in the NBA at 9 games. The Cleveland Cavaliers, who are second in defensive rating in the league. Now they're second in the East, 5 games back of the Celtics. That probably goes to show you how good the Celtics have been this year because the Cavaliers are 35-16. Donovan Mitchell is second in the league in steals per game. He's 5th in points per game. And admittedly, Hillbilly, I haven't watched many Cleveland Cavaliers games. So how have they been able to finally put it together? Because this is what they envisioned when they traded for Donovan Mitchell a couple years ago.
Yeah, I think this is pretty close to it, being firmly in contention for a championship run, which I think is where they are. And it's crazy because if you had checked in about 2 months or a month and a half ago or so, you would have thought they were about to trade one of their major players, maybe even Donovan Mitchell, just because things were not going well at all. It was really kind of a disappointment. And then Evan Mobley gets hurt, Darius Garland gets hurt, and you think, well, now they really are going to tank. Like maybe they'll trade away Evan Mobley. Who knows? It's just not working out. And then Jared Allen and Donovan Mitchell figure something out together. They go on this crazy winning streak where they are just destroying teams by like 30 points. It seems like every night I turn them on, they're just destroying the team in front of them. And then now we've gotten Evan Mobley back and Darius Garland have come back, and they have, while they were gone, it's kind of like the team figured it out. And so a little bit worried when those players came back, like, are they still going to have that kind of, are they going to be able to gel like that? And they've come back and just found their roles. Evan Mobley's finally shooting 3-pointers so that they can stretch out the floor. It's really, really encouraging to watch them. And I'll tell you, their coach really deserves a lot of the credit for it, in making that happen and finally seeing how to get this team that, from a roster construction standpoint, they have a lot of redundancies. Evan Mobley is a lot like Jared Allen. And Darius Garland is a lot like Donovan Mitchell. And that's not typically a good thing for, your 4 best players to be that much like each other. But they've managed to figure it out. And they are right now in an East that doesn't have a lot of stability outside of Boston. They are right up there. I mean, I don't know that I could see them beating Boston in a 7-game series. But if like Porzingis were to get hurt, the Cavs are one of the teams that could kind of swoop in, take advantage of the vacuum at the top and make it to the finals.
Okay. It's kind of interesting. I kind of think of them as the Thunder of the East, but the Cavs have more experience. Maybe not playoff experience, but even in
Donovan Mitchell's one of the best playoff performers in NBA history. I mean, you look at his numbers in the playoffs and he's right up there with like the Kobe Bryants and the Michael Jordans of the world.
Spida.
Just incredible playoff performance. So you know what he's capable of doing at least. But yeah, I mean, they've both got a lot of young teams. I mean, Donovan Mitchell's still a young player. It's just remember that while those two teams are that close to each other, the Thunder are also sitting on a mountain of draft cap. Like the same amount that a team like Detroit has, who has nothing.
They could draft Bronny.
Yeah, they could waste a draft pick on him though. In all seriousness, though, they could throw one away too high on him just to kind of make that happen.
That also means you could get a year of LeBron James,
You could, which probably wouldn't be the worst thing for them. So
LeBron James.
So Cleveland is they're performing really. They're 9-1 in their last 10 games. as I said, longest active winning streak in the league, and they're second. That's 5 points behind Boston. Boston has kind of separated themselves at the moment, but they're ahead of a team that we're going to talk about that is on Hillbilly's bad surprises in the East. We're not going to start with them, though. Those are Hillbilly's 5 good surprises. Thunder, Timberwolves, Celtics, Clippers, Cavs. They're all doing really well. They're all top 2, 3 in their conference.
Congratulations.
Let's go to the bad surprises. Hillbilly and the Lakers, the Los Angeles Lakers, who currently are sitting in 9th place in the Western Conference. We can talk about the in-season tournament here because they are the winners of the inaugural in-season tournament, which I feel like a lot of people were, while watching it, got swayed over to the side that, okay, this is a fun thing to watch. This is a thing that's going to be here for a while, because even the group stage games that you watched, the teams played harder. Statistically, the games were closer. And then you get to the Las Vegas, and it was kind of just cool how to watch the LeBron James playing for a trophy in December. Now, the fact is, that has kind of cost the Lakers in other ways, like in the regular season, Hillbilly, because they are 28 and 26 at the moment.
Yeah, it did. It's at least a coincidence. I don't know. I mean, they immediately after expending a lot of energy in the in-season tournament, because LeBron has to have that trophy, they go on to, they only win like 2 out of their next 13 games, and they just go right back down in the standings. And then what's really disappointing from a Lakers, if I was a Lakers fan, which I'm, obviously not, but if I were, what's really disappointing with this team is that they are middle of the road. They've been there pretty much all season. They're in 9th right now. They've typically been right around there, right around this the 500 mark. Yet they couldn't ask for more from a health standpoint than what they've gotten from LeBron James and Anthony Davis. I mean, out of a possible, I think it's 54 games, Anthony Davis has played in 50. You can't, that's a miracle for Anthony Davis. Like, this may be the healthiest year he's ever had. Maybe he had another one when he was younger, but it's definitely the healthiest year he's had in a long time. Definitely did not expect that. And LeBron's played in 48 games. So they have not missed significant parts of it, and they still stink. Or not really stink, I guess, but they're just middle of the road, which makes you wonder, like, what is their upside this year? And what's the chances that Anthony Davis and LeBron James aren't going to get at least one significant injury between them? And what is a 500 team that the Lakers are going to look like when either one of them misses a significant amount of time? Austin Reeves has been better recently, but, we really kind of thought he was a budding star for the Lakers that they had gotten, stolen in the draft, really. But he had a really rough start to the year. Like I said, he has been playing better recently, but he's not really developing as that, big time member of like a big 3 type player that people thought maybe he could be. So it's just been a little bit of a disappointing year for them. LeBron is sending out stupid little emojis or whatever, at opportune times to try to get the conversation about him. And, the Lakers didn't do anything at the trade deadline. I don't think they made a single move. It's maybe everything's not happy there. It's a disappointing year if you're a Laker.
Yeah, but then again, even if they are in the play-in, you can't count out LeBron James, But again, we'll have to see, because the injury bug has not affected the Lakers so far, but history says it will at some point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So number 2 on your list of bad surprises, Hillbilly. Bad time to be a Laker fan right now. The Pelicans. Pelicans who are 6th.
Yeah, and I say it's because the Pelicans were one of those teams that were just incredibly exciting for the last couple of years. But it was always that kind of, like, you get really excited by them, but you always left wondering what if, because either Zion or Brandon Ingram get injured and always get injured late in the year. And so you never see him. Like last year, maybe right about at this point in the year, they were, or maybe it was a little bit earlier, they were tied for first in the West. And Zion was just destroying everybody. And we were sitting there looking like, could this actually be the best team in the league if they're all healthy? And what are the chances of Zion would ever be healthy? And then this year, again, kind of the same thing with the Lakers. Zion has been relatively healthy. He's played in 42 games so far. For the Pelicans, I think they've played like 53 games. So he's played in the overwhelming majority of games this year for them. And they're still not in contention. They're definitely not a contender. They're not playing like it. Zion scoring like 22.3 points per game, which is good, but it's not, I guess, what we were hoping we would see if he actually had a healthy year. And the thing that's discouraging about Zion from my standpoint is like, if this is what he is, do we really see him as having the kind of discipline to make himself into an even better player? It seems unlikely.
Yeah.
It's a shame because the Pelicans are really well put together. They've got a lot of other really awesome players. They have built their general manager, who's the same guy that was in Cleveland with LeBron. He's really put together an awesome team that's just looking for a superstar to take it over. And Zion, even when he's healthy this year, is not filling that role. Now, he's still really young. So, maybe he will grow into it, but he just, I don't know. Every time you turn around, it seems like he's doing something else, but he's only 23 years old, so who knows?
Yeah, you never know, but it hasn't looked so great for Zion so far, just because of the injuries and the way he's taking care of himself, like you said. I want to move on to this next team, though, Hillbilly, because you like to follow this team a little bit, I think. The third place team in the East, that would be the Milwaukee Bucks. Milwaukee Bucks, by the way, who are first in the league in restricted area field goal percentage, and also first in the league in number of coaches this season. They have 2.
Cool facts, bro.
Yeah.
Would you like to tell us about what is going on? A team that was second, I believe, in the East when they fired their coach, who they hired before the season started, and replaced him with a coach named Doc Rivers.
Yeah. Well, if you watch the Bucks, every time you watch one of their games, you're amazed at their record because you're like, how can they have a record that good when they're playing this? I mean, the defense has been just abysmal all year long. And I knew that Damian Lillard had a bad reputation as a defender, but man, he has been horrible defensively. And they just don't have anybody around Giannis and Lillard anymore. Chris Middleton seems like he's going to be kind of maybe about an average to above average player. And then after that, everybody else on the team is below average, I guess, except for Brook Lopez, who's still, a really good player. They just have not been replenishing the talent. You look at how a team like Boston is managed, where every move they make is a smart move, bringing in players that really work out, like Derek White and Porzingis. And then you look at the Bucks, and they bring in Jay Crowder, who's just washed out. They bring in Joe Ingles, who's not even on their team anymore. All the moves that they make to try to keep, the team going around Giannis are just not working out. I hope maybe Doc Rivers, he doesn't seem to be the best coach in the world. I mean, record-wise, given the talent that he's had. But maybe he's a big enough name where he can get people to listen to, because if they could just buy in defensively. It's been really disappointing to watch the Bucks, but I still think the Bucks are a contender. Just because if they could buy in defensively and just get it okay defensively, they've got that 1-2 punch with Damian Lillard and Giannis that in the playoffs, that kind of very difficult to stop offense, even when your defense is as focused and geared in as it is in the playoffs, having an option like that even a totally tweaked defense can't handle that kind of thing is really valuable in the playoffs. And so I still think that they could get there. And Giannis has been going absolutely ballistic this year. He's having a fantastic year statistically, but if you watch him, I mean, he cares desperately about every single minute of every game. He's diving for every loose ball, driving the coaches crazy because he just plays like a maniac. You can see how much he wants to win again, which makes me a little bit worried for Giannis's future in Milwaukee because, I could see them being a contender if they figured some things out, but I could also see it getting ugly quick because they just have so little talent backing them up and Giannis getting pretty upset about the way things are there.
Yeah. Obviously, when you have Giannis Antetokounmpo, I think you're going to be a contender. He's third in the league in points per game, first in fast break points per game, and points in the paint. But the fact that they fired their coach, who wasn't there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, he was there for 40 games, and they let him go. Now, that doesn't happen very often in the NBA where they fire a coach and then immediately they hired a new one. They don't just have an interim. The Hawks did it with Quinn Snyder a year or two ago, but we
Didn't
don't see
work
that
out.
in the NBA. How I have to know what your reaction was when you heard that they fired Adrian Griffin.
Well, I wasn't surprised. I mean, a few weeks or maybe a month before that, you had the incident where Giannis refused to come out of the game, just openly defiant of the coach, just like, I'm not going to do it. And he just sat at the scorer's table, and it was just humiliating for the coach. And you could tell Giannis had already had it with him. And, obviously the Bucks will do anything Giannis wants, to desperately trying to keep him in Milwaukee. So, you could tell the writing was on the wall. I mean, the people joke that his brother Thanasis Antetokounmpo, who's also on the team, is the most untradeable player in the NBA.
That's
like
right.
You could offer the Bucks whatever you want, they will not trade that guy because they just don't want to piss off Giannis. So it wasn't really surprising to see that. I think they had to make a move, and I mean, things really were not going well. The defense was just awful. He initially, this coach, he was an assistant coach in Toronto last year, and he was running their defense. And their defense was great, but they had a totally different type of roster on Toronto than we do in Milwaukee, where you have the big bigs, in the middle. And Lopez, who's not, as good as he is, he's not the most mobile guy in the world. And he tried to install that same system in Milwaukee, and he just stubbornly kept trying to do it, where you have Brook Lopez, playing up on pick and rolls, not dropping in coverage, which is what he's good at doing. And he looks awful out there on the perimeter defensively. It's misusing the talent. And he was just stubborn about doing that. You could see that he was losing the team. I think it was the right move to make, getting rid of him. Probably shouldn't have hired him in the first place, but I guess you never know. And I think getting Doc in the middle of the year, I think if you're going to make that kind of a move, you need to do it with somebody that has a lot of gravity and a lot of reputation like Doc does, so that maybe he can get everyone to listen to him and try to salvage it.
It does. So I have to ask you, if you could predict, what do you think is going to happen under Doc Rivers? Because it hasn't started out so well. They've played 7 games since he first coached against Denver. They've lost 5, won 2. They're beating the Nuggets right now by 16 points in the third quarter. So maybe they'll win that one. But it hasn't started out so well. That doesn't mean it's going to, go badly the rest of the time. But what would you predict is going to happen the rest of the season?
Well, I mean, I think they'll wind up being a good team just because, I mean, Damian Lillard and Giannis Antetokounmpo are remarkably good. They just, like I said, they don't have anyone around to help. Mm-hmm. But, at this point, I mean, you can't really expect anything from the team this early in Doc Rivers' tenure. There's no way that he's installed a system, gotten everybody on board with what he's doing. I think you have to throw, these last couple weeks out. It's really going to be after the All-Star break that we'll start to see, when he gets a little bit of time with his team, a break in the games to kind of really get his team the way that he wants it. Then we'll start seeing after the All-Star break. I worry about that team, and I worry about Giannis there.
Oh no. And that's why it's a good time to do our little basketball update podcast, because it is the All-Star break. Like after Thursday or whatever, if you're not playing in the All-Star game, you've got a week off.
Yeah. And even if you are, you basically have a week off. I mean, they don't take anything. I haven't watched one of those games in a long time because they're just off. But they still have a lot of extra time with their teams. Try to kind of restart.
But your next team on this list is another familiar team that we've talked about a lot on this podcast. Maybe not on the bad surprises list, though, is Golden State. The Warriors are below the Lakers at the moment. They are 10th in the West. They have a 500 record, 25-25. Steph Curry is still doing amazing things. If you watch the game against the Suns on Saturday night, where with 3 seconds left, he has to turn around, shoot a 3, and, bank it to win. He's the only player in NBA history who, this season, in a 4-game span, averaged at least 40 points, where he shot 50, 40, 100, 50% from the field, 40% from 3, and 100% from the free throw line. And he is first in the NBA in 3-pointers made.
That's facts.
But as we've talked about with these other teams too, you need players around you to be a good team. And the Warriors have players like Draymond Green and Klay Thompson. Draymond Green, hasn't played in every game this season.
No, he did miss a couple for, I forget why, He punched somebody, I think.
Oh yeah, I was actually wondering what happened. He did punch somebody on the court. That's why
I think what was the most recent one was with I can't remember the guy, where it looked like he was flailing, but it was pretty clear he was actually punching him.
That's happened. Steph Curry's still great. They're first in screen assists, I guess, in the league, if that means anything. But the Warriors are 10th in the West right now, Hillbilly. What is going on with Golden State?
Well, I think the disappointment for me is that, this was kind of the make or break year for Klay Thompson's recovery. Like, what is he going to be now? You've got to, coming back from the kinds of like multiple horrifying injuries that he had successively, like, it's reasonable to think that the first year or two back, he might not quite be himself yet. But I mean, we're like 3 years out from that now. He's playing the worst. Actually, I think it is the worst he's ever played, even including his rookie year. Just a shell of himself out there. Seems like he's losing confidence. He's getting benched in closing minutes regularly. And he's moping about that, which I don't blame him. I mean, it sucks to happen. And, Draymond being absent, Draymond being the distraction that he is, all those things put together have just caused, a lot of problems for him. Recently, they have been kind of turning it around, though. Like, you look at them and they've won 4 in a row, 7 out of their last 10. They've been playing much better ball. And what's happened is that they've brought Kuminga into the starting lineup, which is something that I think had to happen. Kuminga was Jonathan Kuminga, who I think was like their 7th pick a couple of years ago in the draft. And he's scoring, he looks like he's a mid-20s scorer, consistent, plays good defense. He's finally giving him that second punch that you need to go with Steph Curry. So, it's been disappointing because it's sad to see the old team go. I really liked watching the Warriors in their heyday. And it's sad to see Klay Thompson go and Draymond Green just shoot himself in the foot over and over again. But, now we are seeing guys like Jonathan Kuminga step up, and Brandon Podziemski, who's their rookie this year, has also been playing really well for them as he gets more minutes. He's closing out games instead of Klay Thompson recently. Mm-hmm. So maybe they're on to something and they'll get back to it. I mean, Steph Curry is still, he is the player. If it's the very, very end of a game, in the playoffs and it's, tied up or in clutch minutes, who else do you want other than Steph Curry? I mean, he is the greatest shooter in NBA history. He's always confident, never seems like the moment's too big for him. So, who knows? It's tough to count the Warriors out, and they are doing better now, but they do have a lot of issues with a lot of the players on their team this year.
I think the issue is that they don't have Jordan Poole anymore. And Jordan Poole absolutely killing it in Washington, D.C. Isn't that right, Hillbilly?
Yeah, he's having a forgettable year. I think Washington was really hoping that they would be able to kind of do a reclamation project on him and burnish up his credentials a little bit by giving him a lot of usage and then trade him back off. But he's almost worthless now.
No, it it hasn't worked. So the fifth and final team that doesn't want to be on this list of Hillbilly's bad surprises of the season is Doc Rivers' old team, the Philadelphia 76ers, who are now coached by... Do you see these connections, Hillbilly? Adrian Griffin was the assistant for the Raptors. Who was the Raptors coach last season? Nick Nurse. Who's the coach of the 76ers this season? Nick Nurse. Doc Rivers is the coach of the Bucks, and Adrian Griffin was the coach of the Bucks. It all connects itself one way or another.
What are you talking about?
But the 76ers, 31-21, they're 9.5 games back. They're behind the Bucks, the Cavs, the Celtics, but also the Knicks. The Knicks, who I think we're going to talk about in just a second when we get to the trade deadline. They're first in steals per game. Tyrese Maxey is the second youngest player in NBA history to score 50 points in a game and have no turnovers. Jason Tatum was the only one who was younger. He was 31 days younger when he did that. But the big thing is, Hillbilly, Joel Embiid, their best player, who is now injured, might miss the rest of the season, too. What's going on with that? And obviously, if he is missing the rest of the season, that's it for Philly.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, well, look what's happened to Philly since he went out. I mean, they went from being one of the best teams in the conference right up there with Milwaukee, because this was before Cleveland's recent surge. They were the ones that were nipping at the heels of Boston, and now they've lost 8 out of their last 10 since Embiid's been down. They're just it's crushing what happened. Embiid was, to my mind, I mean, I know that there are some advanced stats that say that Jokic is better still this year in the regular season. I mean, in the playoffs, I'd take Jokic in a second, but just in the regular season. But to my eye, watching them, Embiid was absolutely monstrous this year. I mean, his scoring was just absolutely absurd. I mean, when he got injured, he was scoring over 35 points per game on 34 minutes.
Most in the league.
Yeah, best in the league. And he was doing it on very efficient shooting. I mean, one of the things about him is that he is like the opposite of like a Shaq or a Giannis that, you foul at the end of the game. He is one of the best free throw shooters in the league. He shoots almost 90% from the line. And he's 7'2" and monstrous.
Yeah.
It's incredible to watch him play. And, his scoring, I think it's Wilt that has the all-time record for scoring average in a year, and it's like 50-something points. You can argue that this is more impressive because Wilt played almost 48 minutes a game. He never came out. He played every minute. If you extrapolate it out from minutes played, Embiid's actually scoring.
Well, and the quality he's playing against, too.
And, of course, the quality he's playing against, which is something you can never really measure, I guess. But, yeah I mean, it's absolutely remarkable what he's doing. And so much fun to watch. I mean, it's just, you're watching just absolute greatness. I mean, between him and Jokic, you're watching two of the very greatest centers to ever play the game. I mean, it's got to be reminiscent of watching like Wilt and Bill Walton play. But sadly, he's not there. And it stinks because, a couple weeks ago, I would have had the Philly on the positive side as far as, they're a good surprise. They got rid of James Harden. That had to end. It wasn't going to end well, but it did exactly what everybody in Philly was hoping. It gave Tyrese Maxey room to breathe, room to grow, and show that he's incredibly good. We kind of knew this from last year that he is just a really amazing player. But, he has really shown it this year. And so to see all that happening, it sucks to see it. It stinks for Embiid. I think he's going to be 31 next year. So, I mean, do we really anticipate that, he's going to be able to continue playing at this level? I would hope so because of how much fun it is to watch, but the whole thing just seems grim.
Yeah, I can see why that's a bad surprise because his injury, which Jonathan Kuminga fell on his leg, and so he injured meniscus. And then they were like, well, it might be okay. And then ultimately it needed surgery. And so the fact that the NBA.com headline is Sixers hopeful Joel Embiid can return from knee injury this season tells you, I think, what you need to know.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully he'll be okay for next year and they'll be able to make a run. The Sixers have some ammunition, with draft capital, and, good contracts on their team that they can use to get better. And I think they may have made an aggressive move at the trade deadline, but they already knew at that point that Embiid was out. So I think it kind of kept them from doing it.
All right. So Hillbillies, good surprises, bad surprises, as we're the NBA All-Star Game is supposed to be like the halfway point of the season. We're well past the halfway point of the 82-game season, but it's a nice stopping point to reassess, especially with football. All the energy that consumes is now gone. So to wrap up this podcast, Hillbilly, I know you wanted to talk about the trade deadline for a little bit. Some of the teams that may have improved over the trade deadline. I know it happened last week. ESPN had their big trade deadline special, which I didn't watch. Didn't hear much about what happened on the trade deadline, except for possibly the Knicks. The Knicks, who are already in fourth in the East, doing pretty well under Mr. Tibbs, Tom Thibodeau. What do you think about New York in the East? 8 games back right now of Boston.
Yeah, and playing well. It's crazy to see it because of the Knicks that I've known for the last couple of decades, where they've just been one of the most poorly managed. They're a lot like the Washington Redskins were with Dan Snyder. I mean, they would chase after old veterans that have bloated contracts and just waste their money on that, never really build a team the right way. And now it seems like the Knicks are actually doing that. I mean, earlier this year, they made a move with Toronto to get OG Anunoby, who is a defensive menace, one of the very best defensive players in the league. And you put him with Thibodeau, the very defensively minded head coach of the Knicks, and it's just a match made in heaven. They at the trade deadline, they bring in a couple more players on smart salaries. It's interesting to watch how they're building this team. And yet they're still retaining their big knockout or their big home run swing for the offseason. In the event that a player gets disgruntled with their team, they have, I think, 8 tradable first round picks. So they could go after just about any level of player and add it to the team that they have now, which is just built for a superstar to be around it. Jalen Brunson, who, just that name must make every Dallas Maverick fan shiver that they gave him away for absolutely nothing. And he has burgeoned into a guy that really probably should be the starter on the All-Star team this year, over Damian Lillard. Just a fantastic player, great role players all around them. And then they could add, a big talent in the offseason. It's New York. People might want to go there, especially as they see that it's finally a well-run team. Like, if things were to go completely south in Milwaukee and Giannis got frustrated, New York could be a destination for him.
What?
Wow.
And New York knows that, and they finally put themselves into a position to do stuff like that. And it's just got to be a super encouraging time to be a Knicks fan to finally get through this.
How about that? And that's what the league wants too. They finally want the Knicks to be relevant in Madison Square Garden,
And it looks like they're getting there.
Wow, how about that? I will say, before we move on to our final thoughts, one team that we didn't really talk about that I guess I could say understand why you put the 5 teams you did under good surprises, but the Pacers, I'd argue, Hillbilly in Indiana, who are hosting the All-Star game this year. Tyrese Halliburton has basically broken out. He's a starter in the All-Star game this year. He leads the league in assists. Statistically, the Pacers have the best offense in the NBA. They lead the league in points per game, assists per game, field goal percentage, offensive rating, points in the paint per game, mid-range field goal percentage, and bench points per game.
True.
But they're 6th in the East right now, 11 and a half games back. But I really think on the opposite end, when you talk about the in-season tournament, the Lakers won it, and they've collapsed. The Pacers were surprised to get to the final. They lost it, but I feel like it's really helped them.
Yeah, they are the league pass team to watch. I mean, because they score like 150 points every game, and the other team usually scores about 140 points every because they're not playing any kind of defense. But their offense has been this historically good all year long, and they just got Pascal Siakam a couple of weeks ago from the Raptors. Bringing in an all-star level talent to go along with this team they have. As you say, Tyrese Halliburton has absolutely ascended. I mean, he is the future of the league at point guard. If it wasn't for Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, I think you could make an argument that he's the best young guard in the league right now. And it's tons of fun to watch them. They're constantly going up and down the court. It is a lot of fun to watch them, but they don't play anything that looks like defense at all. So it's tough to see them going too far with the things the way they are right now. But it is a lot of fun to watch, and they're definitely on the upswing.
Oh, there's 4 teams who have a worse defensive rating than the Pacers, but they're the Wizards, Hawks, Pistons, and Hornets. So
yeah,
not
yeah.
good company you want to be.
Yeah, they're down there in the cellar with that.
Yeah. But do you think potentially you get into the playoffs? They're a 6 seed right now. They play a 3 seed. The Bucks. If it was Bucks Pacers right now, I feel like it could be interesting.
And the Pacers have owned the Bucks this year. They've humiliated them in some of their matchups. Have just been horrible. So yeah, I could absolutely see that happen.
Just a team that I feel like we might be talking about a little bit when we talk in 2 months for our little playoff preview, the Indiana Pacers. So finally, as I mentioned, Hillbilly, the All-Star game is happening this weekend in Indiana. It's only the second time that Indianapolis is hosting the All-Star game, which I feel like doesn't make sense because the state of Indiana loves basketball. First time since 1985. So I don't really understand that. But it's happening this season. They put a basketball court in the airport in Indianapolis, which is pretty cool. But the fact that they had to revamp the format this year, bring it back from the draft they had, where the 2 captains drafted their teams to the East-West. There was one year, it was 2020, right before COVID, after Kobe Bryant died, where they did the Elam ending format at the end of the game, and that was exciting. And then the next year, it wasn't. And I feel like they might be moving away from that again this year. So I don't know. It just doesn't feel like this is not going to help. Oh, East-West is going to make everything so great again. No, it's not. I mean,
no, they don't take it. They're too tired to take it seriously at this point in the season. Like they're just, they're either gearing up for the playoffs and trying to take as much advantage of this week off basketball as they can, or they're on a team that just sucks so bad that they have already checked out and they already know they're not going anywhere. And it's just, the All-Star game is just bad. It's what it is. I don't know how they can fix it, but
we have to show that out because that is happening this Sunday. The only reason I watched last year is because they had the alternate cast with Ernie, Kenny, Shaq, and Charles, and I'll watch anything they commentate. So that was actually enjoyable. But the game was
terrible.
That's terrible.
Oh my gosh! All right, so Hillbilly, we're kind of at a good stopping point in the NBA season with the All-Star break happening. A week break is about to happen for these teams. What are your overall thoughts of how the season has gone so far with 2 months left until we get to postseason basketball, which I know we're all excited about?
Well, I think it's been a really great season so far and really exciting. One of the things that we talked about in the preseason was the level of talent that's in the league this year and how it's just more than I think it's ever been. And it's because you've had those different stages of these almost generations of players, where you have you still have guys like LeBron and Kevin Durant and Steph Curry killing, well into their NBA dotage. And then you have, the players that, like Embiid that are like 30 years old, the players around him like Giannis, Jokic. And then you have the players that are younger than that like Doncic and the other players that are more around 23 years old, but they're all playing at superstar levels. They're playing at a high level earlier and longer than they ever have been. So you have all of this talent. But what we're seeing this year, I think, is that the talent is so well dispersed in the league that there's just so much more parity than there has been in previous years. I mean, you could call Boston Celtics the favorite to win, and they are the favorite. You know, if I had to pick one team, they are probably who I would pick. But I have really big doubts about them. And then everybody else in the East is kind of hovering right around the same mark. And then out in the West, you essentially have a four-way tie for first place right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Denver Nuggets are in fourth place. They are half a game out of first place. So it is like it changes every night. I think 2 nights ago, or maybe even last night, the Thunder were first. You know, it keeps changing. That's just the level of parity in the league right now, and how many good teams are being made because of it, and why a team like, you know, the Warriors and the Lakers, where they have these aging superstars that are still playing at super high levels, they're not able to just cruise through anymore because there are so many other good teams out there. It's just a ton of fun to watch. You have the really exciting young teams, you know, like I keep gushing about the Thunder, but it's just really amazing to think of what they could do with this team given the amount of draft capital they still have. I just don't think there's ever been anything quite like that. And they've got maybe the best general manager in the league pulling or pushing the buttons on it. So just a lot to be excited about. I think we're really going to see things take maybe a little bit more shape as far as like what teams are actually going to be now after the All-Star break, leading into what is probably going to be a really good postseason.
How about that? You heard it here first, y'all. We are just in time. All of us who were absorbed in other sports. It's time for basketball. Hillbillies let us all know that it's been a pretty good season, and I don't think it's going to stop being a pretty good season, especially with, as Hillbilly just mentioned, all the parity that we've talked about the last few years too. Since the Warriors dynasty really has ended, I guess, there hasn't been a new one that has grown. You could maybe the Nuggets, if they win the championship again, you could start to
but
see
they've
that,
only won one this year, and the Nuggets are kind of right there in the mix. Like they're probably my number 2 team that I would pick, but it's really close. And the thing with the Warriors, remember, you know, what they were really, really good before they got Kevin Durant, but it was Durant that just put them into that level of good lore, like right up there with the 98 Bulls. But that happened because of a kind of financial anomaly in the league. Because of the salary cap just exploded that 1 year where Kevin Durant was available and could do it. It was a really weird confluence of events to make that. Generally speaking, the parity in the league, it's stronger than it's ever been.
Good to know.
Absolutely. Which makes it fun to watch a ton of teams. So y'all, there you have it, our little NBA update at the All-Star break with, of course, our Zander's Facts senior NBA analyst, Hillbilly. Thanks again for coming on the podcast.
No, thanks for having me. It's fun.
Zander's Facts.
Thanks once again to our Zander's Facts senior NBA analyst, Hillbilly, for coming back on the podcast. Once again, he's like, I don't know the official numbers, but he is definitely the most frequent guest we have had on the podcast, and we love it when he comes on and gives us his facts. So that is it for episode 133. Those are all the facts I have this week. Thank you all so much for listening. If you liked the facts that you just listened to on this podcast, remember to follow this podcast, download this episode 133, rate and review the podcast. Check us out on all the socials. I'm on Threads, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all those at Zander's Facts. That is Zander with a Z. And most importantly, remember to tell all your friends. We like to call it spreading the facts around here. Tell all your friends about the podcast, the newsletter, Zander's Weekend Facts. Also, our YouTube channel, Zander's Facts on YouTube. Make sure you go subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can watch this episode with a nice background while you're watching. It's so nice, calm, cool. Go do that. And then check out the Zander's Facts link tree, because that has all the Zander's Facts links that you need for where to get the podcast, the newsletter, the YouTube. Everything Zander's Facts is on the Zander's Facts link tree, which is linked in this episode's description. So, There you have it, y'all. Lots of facts on episode 133 of the podcast. Next week, we are not doing a new episode of the podcast because we've had too many facts recently. I've got to catch my breath. So next week, we're just doing a Zander's Facts flashback. But listen, if you haven't listened to the podcast that we are going to flashback to next week, you might want to listen to that. And even if you have, you might have missed some facts, which is why I always like to do a Zander's Facts flashback periodically because we have a lot of facts on this podcast. You might miss one. So make sure to stay tuned for that next Tuesday, episode 134. Our next new podcast is coming out in 2 weeks on February 28th. Usually that'd be the last day of February, but this year we've got an extra day, y'all. It is a leap year. 2024 means we got an extra day, so February 29th is the final day of February this year, y'all. I don't know why I'm excited about a leap day, but it's like you have an extra 24 hours to do stuff. Like, it's kind of cool. I know it's a Thursday, but either way, I'm excited about that. So stay tuned for episode 134 in 2 weeks. Our Zander's Facts flashback is coming up next week. But that is it, y'all. That is a wrap on episode 133 of the Zander's Facts podcast. Thank you all so much for listening. And we'll see y'all with episode 134 in 2 weeks.
No religion, no anything. Hurt the Bible, hurt God. He's against God, he's against guns.